Talk a little bit about the dynamics of how this coastal habitat can be restored as a buffer, and maybe what the steps that y'all are taking are, and maybe the cost.
Well, there's some big picture thinking, and frankly, we were thinking about this after the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. The big ranch, Powderhorn Ranch, was purchased with fines that were paid to the federal government post-oil spill. Well, that great big 20,000-acre ranch, which is in pristine condition, is a wonderful example of shoreline protection, of a living shoreline. It's got oyster reefs, it's got plenty of land buffer, and it puts something in between a storm and people and things. And when you're talking about living shorelines, that's what you want. You want a good natural buffer that can absorb some of that storm surge or some of that flood water before it gets to people's homes. You've also got in-water systems all over the Gulf of Mexico. You've got oyster reefs that are great wave attenuators that can help bear some of the brunt of that storm surge. You've got seagrasses. All of those natural systems can be first line of defense for storms. So the other thing that we're looking at, though, is even within these communities, we're doing some nice research with Texas A&M University, looking at Rockport, looking at the city of Houston, and asking ourselves, if we had green spaces, unbuilt areas in certain parts of these communities, what would have happened? What would we have avoided in terms of storm damage? So these are not just ex-urban investments. These are rethinking how we create open spaces within these communities so that the next time we see these storms, there's more open space to absorb the results of the storm.
We have the luxury of hindsight in a couple of instances. The oyster reef restoration that the Nature Conservancy has been involved with is as close to home here as Matagorda Bay. How did that fare? Have you had a chance to look at it and see how it?
It actually fared pretty well, because the issue with the oyster reef in Matagorda Bay would have had more to do with an inundation of freshwater inflows, which would have changed the basic salinity. And that oyster reef did pretty well. And one of the reasons we're really pleased to see that, and you'll remember this, Mr. Chairman, we built that oyster reef during a drought. And we were testing at the time whether or not we could get drought resiliency in the Gulf of Mexico, knowing that at some point, if we were building things for drought resiliency, we'd get flood resiliency out of them as well. So that oyster reef was specifically built as habitat to promote the production of oysters in the Gulf of Mexico. We've also are building an oyster reef in Galveston Bay, which is going to be partly harvestable. And that is to determine whether or not we can combine habitat reefs with harvestable reefs to rebuild the fishery. And then you can also build these things for coastal resilience. So that's an example of natural infrastructure that can perform on a whole variety of fronts.
By the way, I fished Half Moon Reef after it started growing, and it's very good fishing over there.
Well, quick funny story about that. That is, of course, an oyster reef, but one of the things we noticed right after we built it was that all of the recreational fishermen were going out there and fishing. So we attached an economic study to it and quickly realized that you could rebuild a reef of that size about every 18 months with just the money that is generated in recreational fisheries.
And at some point, I believe you do hope to open it up to harvesting, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So they're not marine protected zones. They're actually recreational zones and commercial fishing zones as well. What is Nature Conservancy looking at for the future regarding hurricane prevention and habitat restoration?
What we are doing specifically, we're doing four things. First of all, we did a poll. We shot a poll in the entire region that was affected, and there's just no question the vast majority of people that live and work and reside in these communities are interested in rethinking how we rebuild. People don't want to see this same thing happen over and over again. So people's attitudes are in the right places to make different kinds of investments. The second thing we're doing is modeling where you can leave open spaces in these communities to avoid some of the flooding that we saw in places like Houston, but also in Rockport, so that the next time a storm comes through, you've got more open spaces to absorb these storm surges. The third thing that we're doing is working with FEMA and how can we actually invest in open spaces such that it starts to positively impact flood insurance. In other words, these green spaces count for natural climate solutions under FEMA, and they could actually lower the insurance premiums that people are paying. And we think affordability can be an important part of this as well.
Yeah. If there's anything else you'd like to add before I move on. Okay, I've worked with Jim Gibeaut over the years, And he deals a lot with the first line of defense of the Texas coast called the Barrier Islands. And he's done research with several groups and is working with the General Land Office right now. Jim, tell us a little bit about what it is y'all are looking at regarding sea level rise and storm surge.
Sure. Well, I work at the Hart Research Institute, and I have a lab there called the Coastal and Marine Geospatial Lab. And those of you who know about HRI, which is an institute, research institute here on campus, know that we're interdisciplinary, and we take projects from sometimes relatively basic science all the way and make the results available for policy making, or even analyze a policy that could stem from some of our results. And so my particular interest most recently has been looking at coastal change, the biophysical changes in the coastal environment around Texas, but other areas around the Gulf of Mexico as well. And when I talk about change, I'm talking about how things have changed over the last 100 years, for example, on that order of time scale. I am a geologist, but I work all in the modern. So, and the types of change we're looking at are how are the marshes growing or disappearing, turning to other environments such as open water or tidal flats, where the shorelines have been, where they've been moving, and just the relative dynamics of the coastline over decades, the previous decades of time. And then we take that information and we match it up with the processes, the drivers of those change, such as sea level rise is a major, major driver, as well as major storms along the Texas coast. And then we take those processes and we match the observed changes, and we create models to project how we think things will change in the future. How much the shoreline will erode or accrete in this area, or whether this is an area where a lot of the marsh will disappear, convert to open water, or perhaps marsh and other wetlands will migrate up into the upland areas. So that's what we spend a lot of time on modeling, but of course we can't just leave it at that, or else we would have limited impact on how we live along the coast. So one product that we've come up with is what we call geohazards maps of barrier islands along the Texas coast. And in a single map, for example, we have one of Mustang Island. We have it with 4 colors. Red are where our currently existing very critical environments are. On the Gulf side, those are our beaches and our protective foredunes. On the bay side, those are marshes and tidal flats and tidal creeks and that sort of thing. So those are places that everybody recognizes that we can't go in, and I shouldn't say everyone recognizes this, but disrupt them. And they're serving currently a very important service. They're performing very important services to us as in their natural environment, natural state. Then the next color would be because things are not staying the same. We're experiencing sea level rise, and we have ongoing storms. Those very critical environments that we have today are going to migrate and change, and they're going to move. And so yellow is the color on those maps that show where we expect those environments to occur in 60 years' time. And then we have a couple of other colors that show uplands and very high uplands, relatively speaking high uplands. Now, we don't necessarily propose or promote development of barrier islands to begin with. If we were to create a geohazards map of the entire United States with just 4 colors, all of our barrier islands would be painted bright red, okay? However, that's not the reality of the situation. We have lots of economic things going on along the barrier islands. But we do need to recognize that there's smart ways to do it, or smarter ways to do it than what we have been doing. Areas that we should avoid, perhaps trade off other areas for development for these more today's critical areas, as well as what we project will become critical areas as sea level rise and more storms strike the coast. So that's one very important.
I think people would be interested to know also from your hindsight after you did the modeling and everything, and I'm sure you incorporated major events like hurricanes into that modeling, how, of course, we have the benefit of two virtually uninhabited islands, no due respect to Port Aransas, most of that island doesn't have that much, development on it, and but it's for sale. Obviously San Jose Island is uninhabited virtually except for that one house, and Matagorda Island as well. After y'all saw what happened in Galveston, then we're going to come south to my home, Padre Island. I mean, can we project some things about the damages that would occur here if we had similar circumstances as Galveston had with Ike?
With Ike, yes. Ike in 2008.
Because you studied that pretty carefully,
yes,
I believe.
Yes. We would fare much better along Mustang Island, just qualitatively speaking, with regard to beach erosion and overwash across Mustang Island in particular, than what Galveston Island fared and much of Bolivar
What's the major
Peninsula.
difference between those two besides the development?
It's our dune system.
I see.
We have a relatively high and stable dune system. That means it's vegetated, and that is really our first line of defense. We did conduct one study where we looked at every 50 meters along Mustang Island about what level of protection, and we modeled what level of protection of a storm causing overwash that the particular foredune or the dune system would provide to the environments or the developments behind it. And that study shows that Mustang Island is much better off. Of course, that's no surprise. Most people can look there, but I think a lot of people may not appreciate just how important those barrier dunes are in preventing the overwash. And in fact, we went further in the mission of HRI to take it further. We actually valued the protective function of those barrier islands with my colleagues at HRI.
Yeah.
And we can even provide, in terms of dollars, for one particular protection, one particular service that those dunes provide along Mustang Island. And we need to start thinking a lot about that kind of trade-offs that we're making. When we're developing in one place versus another, what are we trading off in terms of not just a nice, natural, pretty environment that everyone enjoys, but also the resiliency that those natural environments provide us. And we need to start thinking more along those lines.
Well, and how does some of that translate to policy? I know on, I believe, Mustang Island or Nueces County, we were fairly forward thinking where we did a 300-foot setback, I believe, on development. It annoyed a lot of people who owned the property because they felt like they couldn't, use their own property. But when in hindsight, was that probably the smartest thing to do?
Perhaps, but there are lots of other things that go into a decision like that.
Yeah.
But what we need to do as scientists and what we strive to do at HRI is to provide that information, at least in a form where people can make better decisions, or even the decision makers have the information that they need and they know the trade-offs that we're making.
And that's why you're working with the GLO, I believe, to try to direct some of the policy.
Right. We're working with the GLO, and we have been for a number of years now, on the Texas Coastal Resiliency Master Plan, is what it's called. And this is led by the GLO, and we're a primary partner along with a couple of other groups working on this plan. And not to mention the about 100 members of what we call our Technical Advisory Committee to help advise us on what strategies to improve resiliency that we should use. And we get very specific down to particular projects that should be implemented.
Yeah. Let's move on. I don't know, the medicine doesn't always taste very good when you advise the policymakers, but I'd like to maybe move inland a little bit. A lot of people here have relatives or just watched what occurred in Houston and maybe wondered, how would we fare here from a Texas water development perspective and what you've looked at from rivers and things like that, dams, how would we fare on with a 50-inch rain somewhat inland? I mean, that's a lot of uninhabited area, and we're not as dense, but, you know, what would it look like here?
I imagine it probably wouldn't look very good.
Yeah.
Fortunately, at the Texas Water Development Board, we have a group. The acronym is TNRIS. Most people, a lot of folks frankly don't know a whole lot about the Water Development Board, but especially probably wouldn't know this group TNRIS. That's our state's lead GIS group, meaning they do all the mapping.
About floodplains and things like that?
Flood inundation mapping, floodplain mapping. It's highly sophisticated. It's very well done. We had hydrologists from TNRIS that were working around the clock in the state's Emergency Operations Center over the course of Hurricane Harvey, providing emergency management officials with maps to help them with potential evacuation decisions as the event was unfolding. And fortunately, the legislature last session saw it fit to direct some additional money to the agency for various flood mitigation strategies, including that will support TNRIS and their efforts to improve mapping so that we can be ready for the next event. So it's pretty sophisticated what these folks can do on big giant Google Maps and be able to throw in all the theoreticals of this much rain in this area over this period of time and show you pretty darn close to accurate. And we've been able to test this now because of past events like the big Sabine flood, the records flood on the Sabine a couple years ago. And a lot of these flood events, you do have time to respond and evacuate and move people out of harm's way in many cases. And that's been a success, I think, of the agency.
Well, when it hit Houston, though, I mean, was it just beyond anything you could have planned for or anything you could have prepared for?
I think that's probably fair to say yes. Yeah. I mean, you got to understand the sheer amount of rain. I think the records were just shattered.
Right.
I mean, across the board. So you hear reference to once in 100 year, once in a 500 year. This was just completely off the charts.
Yeah.
And we don't design infrastructure for those types of events. That's not standard. And I think I'm sure there's plenty of, I know there's engineers in the crowd would say you would never design certain infrastructure for some off-the-chart event like that.
Yeah,
it's just,
yeah.
but
at the same time, we know now that mistakes were made along the way regarding development and water,
sure,
floodplains and things like that.
And what's very scary about the Harvey event was, what would have happened if the storm had been a little further south and been a direct hit on the port of Corpus Christi and our ship channel? What if it had shifted to the north and you have the sort of nightmare scenario that's been talked about for a long time up in Houston with a Katrina storm or a Harvey storm that is a direct hit on the Houston ship channel, and what that would do to cripple our nation's petrochemical industry. And that's why we're still talking about this and what to do and what's next and how to be better prepared. There's lots of challenges in that regard, but it's good to have folks in a room like this, the policymakers, the thinkers, the legislators, so that we can not just respond to events. I mean, the history of the agency that I worked for was that it was created in response to the worst drought ever. Mm-hmm. and we've been very successful in things we've accomplished in the last 60 years at this agency. Certain programs, the SWIFT program was created in response to the drought in 2011, and we've been successful in things that have been accomplished. But good policy, it can come from the reaction to a disaster, and we have examples of that. But I think most everyone in this room would agree. Collectively, we got to figure out ways to address it in advance. Because if we get that storm that hits us here in Corpus head on, or in Houston, heaven forbid, if we're not better prepared for it, it's going to be a real struggle.
Well, put your candidate hat on. I'm sure you've thought about policy changes and who's going to pay and how much it's going to cost and things like that. You mentioned it earlier. I'd like you to address it now.
My candidate hat. Yeah, I'm about ready to take that candidate hat off. I see. It's good to see some friends I know traveled in from out of town. I'll warn you: do not listen to the radio. Do not listen to talk radio right now. I've been accused of in the past of being maybe too much of a realist. Maybe it's just from the experience of presiding over an agency that rightfully so has to go to the legislature and fight for a budget every couple years. I feel like our agency was, again, very successful in doing a tremendous amount with very little when it came to our footprint and our state's budget. Fortunately, that was because voters a number of years ago, again, voters statewide authorized $2 billion to be transferred from the state's rainy day fund into a new financing program that the board administers, which has been very, very successful. And the irony, there's obviously lots of ironies when you are a candidate and you're involved in the campaign process, but my opponent and people that support my opponent say that as chairman of the water board, I was this big spender of taxpayer dollars and present it that way. When the reality of the SWIFT program, that many of you know, was, again, a voter authorized program that's funded billions of dollars of water infrastructure at no cost to state taxpayers. No state direct appropriation was made to fund that $2.7 billion worth of water infrastructure that was accomplished the last 3 years through that one program. The last several years, being in the Capitol, working with legislators that I know care very much about water policy and infrastructure specifically, there's always been a bit of a disconnect and a challenge when I go in and get called into meetings to say, well, okay, of course we want to build these reservoirs. Of course we want to have these flood mitigation strategies and projects. The Ike Dike sounds like a good idea. It's been studied. There's been a lot of money invested in studying that as a strategy. But who pays for it? At the end of the day, how does it get paid for? And I just, having been chairman of the board and going and fighting, for a budget, and there's just not a lot of money to go around. And so being able to communicate and effectively prioritize the need for certain projects is key. But moving forward, if you're talking about a $12 billion, I've seen different estimates, of course, on the Ike Dike strategy, but $12 billion, there's not a local community that by itself has the financial capacity to take on a project like that. It's unrealistic to think that you can just go to the federal government and have them cut a check for it. And the state has been struggled to come to terms with wanting to spend a lot of direct money on these types of projects, at least in my experience from when I was at the board. We should try to do as much as we could do with the least amount, and I think the board has accomplished that. But we sort of got to get real and get serious moving forward if we're going to build a $12 billion Ike Dike and understand who's going to pay. Is it going to be the federal government? Does the state need to step up, go back to the rainy day fund, put a question to voters? But we can talk all day and study and plan and talk about strategies. But we need to be more upfront and honest, I think, with voters and taxpayers about what the solutions are and what they're going to cost.
Okay.
And I'd like to make a comment about the policy that follows disasters, because I think you make a really important point, Bech. when the state water plan was funded, which by the way took a vote of the legislature and then it went on a ballot, so Texans approved that investment. So in addition to being part of the rainy day fund and not being directly tax dollars, it was thought of, conceptualized, approved by the Texas legislature, and then agreed to by the people of Texas. What I thought was so significant about that was because that came during a drought condition in this state, one that was unbelievably unforeseen, just like Harvey was. One of the really good policy decisions that was made was that a minimum of 20% of that funding for water infrastructure had to be used for conservation. And there was widespread agreement that the cheapest water supply we'd ever get in this state is through conservation, is just using less water so that we stretch our existing water supplies further and longer. There was an additional 10% that was dedicated towards agricultural investments and rural investments. And I think that that's significant because we turned to a strategy that we might not have otherwise turned to because we were passing policy during a period of time where we were seeing what extreme weather events produce in our state. We're a water-constrained state most of the time. I think that we saw some great thinking after the oil spill, the BP oil spill, where through good work at the federal level and then also at the state level, we drove a lot of those fines and fees into restoring the natural systems that were damaged by that oil spill and building resiliency into our coastal systems. And by the way, those are systems that get far too little investment over time. And so I think what we're seeing now is yet another opportunity to embed in policymaking a response to potential future events. And it's not going to be the same as what we did with the water infrastructure planning, and it's not going to be the same as what we did with post-oil spill. It's different thinking. It's thinking strategically about that natural infrastructure that can provide real live relief for a future storm. And so I think that we're sort of sitting in front of a policy opportunity right now to see what happens at the state and at the local levels in terms of acknowledging this is not just about recovering from a storm, it's about building resiliency for the future.
Laura, I want to stay with you a little bit. After the storm and the Nature Conservancy had some time to take a deep breath, do y'all sit around and powwow about what was done right and what projects maybe should shift based on what you've learned from the storm?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's everybody is evaluating. I think you were talking about evaluating.
He gets the same question in a minute.
Yeah,
too.
well, of course you do. You evaluate how the natural systems performed against the storm that came, and you also think about how systems would have performed if they were in different places. If you had open spaces and new in different places, how would it have performed? So there's no question that people looked at Ike Dike. If Ike Dike had been built, how would that have performed in favor or against the conditions that we experienced in Harvey? There's no question that you want to do that, but I do think you want to be careful about developing a game plan based on the storm that just came, because the next storm isn't going to look the same, and you can't build resilience based on a Harvey scenario. You've got to be far more dynamic in how you're thinking about future floods and storm surges. So you do want to learn from the past, and there's all sorts of modeling that's been done, but you want to be careful to have a broader perspective on what you're going to face in the future.
Sure, you don't want to react just to that. Were there any projects or shifts in y'all's focus that arose from those talks afterwards and the observations made?
Well, I think the conversation that I thought was probably the most interesting, and it's probably the most controversial, is whether or not the floodplain maps were accurately drawn, and whether or not people and things were in places that they shouldn't have been. And I know those are hard conversations to have, but those are the conversations we've got to be willing to at least open up. And even if there's a healthy debate, that for me was a really important conversation, and we're not done with it. We've got to have accurate floodplain maps so that as our state doubles in size, and by the way, our state is doubling in size, so we're going to be building a lot more homes and buildings and businesses, we've got to put them in the right places. And that means that we have to know where floods are going to happen.
What is the smart growth for the coast? I know a lot of that growth is coming to the coast regardless of the danger. Is there some smart growth pointers that we can take away from this and and work toward in the future?
Well, one of them is don't build things in floodways. That'd
I
be
shouldn't have built my
smart.
house on Padre Island, you're telling me? Okay.
I think a lot of the population, the fact is a lot of the population that we're going to see in Texas is going to be moving into one of our big cities. All of our big cities in Texas are doubling in size.
Yeah.
And so really what you're having to think about there is how are you going to plan transportation systems and density such that Houston can double in size, Austin can double in size, San Antonio can double in size, and all of our Texas cities are struggling with that. How can you do that so that you protect quality of life? How can you do that so that you've got good air quality, so that people aren't sitting in traffic all day long? And when we see floods and droughts, people aren't unduly harmed. And so I think all of our big cities are struggling with that. I think density has a really important role in that.
I'm sure. Jim, how did the scientific community, in the aftermath of Harvey, kind of look at the areas they were researching and maybe shift some of their focuses, or did they more or less say we're in the right path?
Well, what happens after a storm in the university community is that everyone looks and tries to find the equipment they had out in the field, for one. And then maybe adjust some dissertations or master's theses research that was in midstream and now has been totally upset. So yeah, sure, yeah, from a practical point of view, there's those kinds of things. There's also funding that's made available from NSF, actually, National Science Foundation, and other funding organizations also, to get researchers funds immediately to get out into the field to capture the event. Because if you don't get out there and measure the impacts right away, then you've lost those data essentially. Mm-hmm. And so NSF recognizes that, and this university is involved in some of those rapid response to Hurricane Harvey, or because of Hurricane Harvey types of projects. Water inflow into the coastal bays is a big subject of study right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Most of the modeling held true?
Well, that is I'm not sure how to answer that.
I'll take it as a no.
Yeah, well, most, no, I don't have a really good assessment of that right now to give you an idea. I will emphasize though is that modeling, you do modeling for different reasons, several different reasons. One is maybe to predict the future, but another reason that you model the natural environment and the processes going on is so that you understand what is relatively important, which parts of the model are more, or processes are the most important. And it just gives you a better idea, a better understanding of the system. And you may be able to hindcast, forecast back into the future and be pretty successful. But the next storm, they're never the same. They're never exactly the same. And that's a good point, I thought, that Laura brought up, that you can't just respond and react to Hurricane Harvey and fix everything that went wrong with Harvey and think you're done, because the next storm will not be the same. I mean, Ike was very different from Harvey. The two parts of Harvey were very different from each other.
Yeah.
It's a tale of two storms, actually. Mm-hmm. And so to address those kinds of things, we do suites of storms and other scenarios to try to cover the full range of dynamics that we could expect to see in the future.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Bech, would you have some perspective from your congressional districts area, where are there areas that need more work than others, and what maybe are the problem areas and the focus areas that you should look at?
Sure. Well, within the congressional district, an area that wasn't just limited or specific to Harvey, but Wharton County, for example, has seen multiple catastrophic floods in the last few years, and that the issue is not unique to Wharton County, but on the Sabine River, they've had. I remember the week or so after the storm, as Governor Abbott had formed the commission to rebuild and pulled all the different agency folks together, and we were visiting different areas. We're in Beaumont, sitting around a table with all the county judges and mayors, and I believe the county judge there said in the last 2 or 3 years, they've had 5 different presidential disaster declarations for flooding. So I'm afraid we've seen in certain areas this is not necessarily limited to this one storm. It's a bigger issue that has played out the last several years from when it comes to flooding, and it's going to have to be the combination of a lot of different things if it's going to be addressed appropriately from a conservation perspective. The low-hanging fruit that we talk about, Laura talks about, that we should certainly look to, but also from I'm afraid the reality, if we're going to take it on, it's going to have to spend some money, and we got to be smart about how we do that. But yeah, Warden in particular within the congressional district, from a flooding standpoint, has been dealing with that over and over and over again. They've got a project there that's been authorized, a flood mitigation project locally in Warden that's been authorized by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for a number of years, and it just has not been able to get any funding.
We're approaching the Q&A portion of the session, and I'm sure there are some questions out there. I know some folks are out there from Houston and all around the coastal bend. So be thinking about your questions that I'd like to, in the meantime, pose to you guys. What have people approached y'all as far as their concerns? I mean, you talk to people very differently than who Bech might talk to. The conservation community, what are their major concerns regarding storm prevention and offsetting of the damage?
Well, I think in general there is recognition, and I don't know that we talk to people very differently. I think that a lot of viewpoints are frankly coming together. I think that people do understand that we're going to have to invest in a combination of natural infrastructure and built infrastructure in order to make sure that this state is resilient for these kinds of things. I think that there is, in fact, our polling tells us there is a universal understanding that we're living in a state that is going to experience a lot more storms and a lot more droughts. And interestingly, they kind of bookend each other. And so I think instead of figuring out what the differences in opinions are, my job is to figure out how do we come together on solutions. And so when I think about resilience and I think about conservation's role in resilience, I think about disruption. We need to build a coast that can withstand disruptions of storms, of flooding, but also surge. And the solution that you'd put in place to solve a flooding problem, you don't want that to create some perverse reaction when you see a storm surge from a different kind of event or a drought. So what I'm seeing is that there is a growing understanding that the natural environment can and does help solve problems. Not only is it beautiful, not only is it productive, not only are these places we want to see, like Powderhorn Ranch, but they are active parts of infrastructure that can help make this state resilient. And I specifically mean resilient to disruption, because I think we need to agree that these are not isolated events.
Right.
And if we can reach agreement that they're not isolated events and they're not going to happen in the exact same places every single time, then what we'll agree on quickly is that we have to have a whole suite of interventions, including natural infrastructure and traditional gray infrastructure, that make this state more resilient. And I just can't emphasize enough, the stakes are high. Our state's population is doubling, and it's doubling in the very places that are seeing the biggest impacts from these events. And so it's our obligation to figure out where to invest in order to solve these problems.
Yeah. Jen, the scientific community may express its interest in the way that it funds projects and research. Have you seen a shift or an upsurge in research grants or the focus of those grants lately?
Yes, there's actually a lot of research funding available in the Gulf of Mexico right now, largely stemming from the Deepwater Horizon BP spill, and all the billions of dollars, much of it goes toward research, and a lot of it goes toward restoration and conservation. And acquisition of new land for preservation. And so, and in order to determine, which are the most viable acquisitions to make or restorations to do, that takes a lot of science in order to do it right. I mean, it also takes monitoring in order to learn from what you've done and to adapt it as you go along. And so there is a lot of, to answer your question, it's really good to be in this business right now in the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, actually.
And it seems to be driven somewhat by what we just experienced. I mean, some of the grant funding, or
well, you mean with the hurricane impacts?
Yeah,
that as well.
Yeah.
That as well. Absolutely. And these restoration projects that we're talking about coming from the settlements of the Deepwater Horizon spill are taking. Well, we're working hard on making sure that they are designed with the future involved, and that expectations are met for how long, say, a particular marsh environment would last, what you should couple it with, perhaps oyster reefs to help protect the marsh, and then perhaps for the town upland of that, another line of defense that would be some kind of a engineering structure, a bulkhead or something like that. And so we're trying to put together those systems of restoration and protection and improving the quality of the ecosystem, all in these same strategies.
So, Bech, what are you hearing from potential constituents along the trail? What are their major concerns in the aftermath of Harvey? I'm sure it's still fresh on many other minds.
You bet. And for me personally, Harvey was a big part of the reason why I decided to leave the Water Development Board and enter this race, because of not just that our family was personally affected, but the area that I grew up in and care very much about is I'm concerned and view that this is going to be a long-term recovery, and that it's going to need to involve the involvement of the federal government in various ways. And I think folks recognize and are still going through the different levels, sort of stages of grief, so to speak. But I look, currently I live in Rockport, and so I see it every day. And I don't think in this immediate area here that the storm hitting, the response, the local leadership, I mean, truly leadership at the local level that came together to begin the recovery process, not just the response, but now the recovery, has been really amazing. And it's, they still need the help of both the federal and state government, but there's a resiliency here locally that folks aren't going to sit around and wait for it. If I'm successful in what I'm doing, I'm gonna be pushing every button I can and pushing every agency I can. That should be the role of whoever represents the area at every level, and I know it's happening certainly with state legislators that you heard from earlier. But I think folks have faith that we're going to rebuild, and it's going to be better than it ever was before.
Laura, I'd like to hear your optimism level. We've just experienced some major catastrophes, and I know that brings people together, and it also certainly furthers policy changes and things. Are you seeing the policy and are you optimistic about where they're headed and the work that we're doing together?
I'm hopeful. I would say I'm hopeful. I think the federal aid package was a little bit better than we were concerned about that for a period of time, that it was not going to be as big as it needed to be, and it's not, but it's not. It's bigger than we thought it was going to be. We wanted that aid package to be really dynamic so it could address the range of issues that we've discussed up here and the previous panel discussed. But a lot of the decision making will happen at the state and local level. I mean, those are ground level decisions, and so I'm always optimistic at the local level because my background is local government. I think that is people see those problems closest to the ground. They know their neighbors. They know exactly which streets flooded. So I am optimistic because I just think that we've seen too much in this state in the last decade to be naive about what the future holds in terms of more of these kinds of events. And I think we've got too much technology, too much knowledge, too much research and modeling to make the same mistakes.
Yeah.
And I'm hopeful because events like this are happening, right? We're having better conversations than we used to have.
And I'll add to that. I think hopefully another reason to be optimistic, looking ahead to the next legislative session, I can tell you, I believe as a state, when you look at money that will be available in the next session, we're coming in a much better scenario situation from, price of oil, barrel of oil example, how we fund our state government than we were in the last interim coming into session, where all the agencies were told, come with a budget request with a off the top 4% cut, and then cut more, and the state's going to have to we've already expended some money at the state level, certainly at a high level, in response to Harvey, and some of that's going to need to be paid back, so to speak. But I believe that if you ask Comptroller Hager, looking ahead to whatever his budget revenue estimate's going to be, just in general, it should be a rosier picture from a state economy standpoint than it was a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Everybody on the panel deals with all political sides, and I know at one point, if you were a conservationist, you were labeled a certain political slant, and if you were a developer, you were, or pro-business, you were on the other side. And in my 20-something years in writing about conservation and wildlife and recreational issues in wildlife, I've noticed there has been somewhat of a coming together. Have y'all seen that too? I think that science has played a large role where we're starting to pay more attention to it and be less skeptical despite the national conversation.
Yeah, I think that has come along, and it's largely, partly because of how we not just come up with our applied results and leave it at that, but we're able to translate it and people see how that impacts the economy. Beach erosion or overwash, or you tear down a dune to build a condominium. Well, isn't there a better way to do it? And you can show the economic impact. And just about in everything that we do, there is information there that people making plans along the coast for more development can improve what they're doing and lessen impact to the environment, thereby lessening the impact of their development. So.
Yeah. Have you seen an opening up of the arms there?
I have, for two reasons. Sort of on what I think of as the inspirational side of conservation, I think that Texans are really united in their love of their landscapes. I mean, if you talk to anybody, they've got a favorite place, whether it's the Piney Woods in East Texas or the Davis Mountains in the West Texas. Texans we're sentimental, and we love those beautiful places in our state, and we've got a lot of them. And so I think we do share that in common. On the other side of it, I know for sure that Texans understand that our successful economy is intricately intertwined with our natural resources.
Exactly. I try to make that point often.
To damage the natural resources is by definition to damage the economy.
Right.
And I think that is an increasingly well understood fact.
I think we recognize that here, especially.
Yeah, I believe so. I've certainly flown that flag for a long time. I'd like to open up the floor to questions if we have, or at least get an indication of any questions you guys might have for the panel, or any points you'd like to bring up to have them address. Speak now.
If you want to talk about border security or immigration reform, or, I'm down for that too.
There's a lot of movers and shakers in this room, I recognize, and some people who hopefully suffered some personal losses, and they probably have some concerns about where the policy is moving. I'd frankly like to hear what your questions and concerns are. So come on up. If not, we're going to blather on. All right, blather on.
Well, you going back to the question about are you seeing the coming together of different political ideology? I'm like you. I'm sure I'm a proud member of CCA.
Yes,
and,
I belong to all of them by default.
SCA, and I mean, you probably recognize if you were at the last CCA banquet walking through there, me as a political candidate, I had a few voters in that room.
I'm pretty sure some of them it's a given. But I mean, people who hunt and fish obviously have often been pegged on one side of the political spectrum, and yet we're the greatest conservationists in the country, and we certainly pay for that conservation. And I believe that finally we're starting to soften up, and we may not use the E word, but we embrace the C word.
Y'all can run with that.
Yeah. Well, we are the Nature Conservancy, so.
Yeah. Well, the Nature Conservancy, I've always felt like, and I know I've promoted y'all for years. The first thing that I heard about the Nature Conservancy was not from the Nature Conservancy. It's from someone who said, "Oh, that's that group that buys land and puts it under glass so nobody can touch it." And I had to do a little research. But that's just simply not the case. Although sometimes there is parcels of land, and I think lately y'all have been bequeathing them to Powderhorn, which is a great project that I wrote about a few months ago. Y'all are not in the park business though, and you don't have the cash to staff these places. So although Powderhorn is a wonderful coastal buffer, it's Parks and Wildlife is better equipped to handle that.
I'll make a comment about that because getting to scale in conservation is really expensive to do. This is a problem that people face all over the world. Land is expensive, protecting water is expensive. Really good conservation work never happens by one organization working in isolation. That's actually a red flag, including if a state is doing it by itself. The really good conservation work in Texas almost always has a public component, a nonprofit component, and importantly, a private landowner component. Over 95% of Texas is privately owned. We will not get this done without private landowners. And in the United States, we have what I think of as the most elegant conservation tool in the world, which is the conservation easement, which allows a private landowner to essentially sell development rights to an organization like the Nature Conservancy or the state of Texas in order to protect their land in perpetuity. And in a state like Texas, that's essential because so much of our land is privately owned, but it also allows private landowners to make their own personal decision about how their property is used in the future. And it turns out that it is a wildly successful paradigm where we all work together in important places, and the Texas coast is one of them. And you've just got a lot of dynamic investment by a whole variety of actors going towards a conservation objective. And it can be a thing of beauty.
I think it's one of the best solutions to offset the fragmentation of wild places, which is generally done when Grandpa dies and 5 or 6 people want their piece of the land, but they never really spent time hunting and fishing on it, so they just want the cash for it. And Grandpa, as I've heard it from several grandpas, they said, "I'm gonna stick it to them kids. They can't develop it, they can't divide it, and it's there for perpetuity." It's a great program.
Well, I can add that in working on the Texas Coastal Resiliency Master Plan with the GLO again, that those acquisition projects or those conservation easement acquisitions are the most highly rated projects. And there's a good reason for that because they're usually fairly large. It's also provides or buys this buffer for us, or this protects the future with sea level rise and how things are changing. There may be a piece of land that isn't particularly valuable with regard to wetlands and shallow bay environments, but it will be in the future. And so those projects are very important and rank very highly among the Technical Advisory Committee for that.
On the flip side of that, do you see much pushback from landowners who resent their property being used as a hurricane buffer or anything like
No,
Mustang Island?
We don't really get down to that level in working with the landowner. It's there are people in the room who know whether or not this is feasible, if we have a willing owner or not, for us to even continue to consider it. But I haven't heard that particular.
Well, and I remember when the 300-foot setback rule in Nueces County came about, there was a lot of disagreement, But I think they've kind of warmed up to the idea, especially after seeing the hurricane damage that could come. And you said that that's probably one of the best policies that sustain those dunes over there. And I mean, they can build a boardwalk over them. They just can't develop, tear them down and build a house next to them, on them. So,
Good question.
all right, cool.
Change the focus a little bit. So we know that the bay in Harvey got scrubbed a lot of seagrass, because I had seagrass this high around the house, 10 foot wide. We know that it covered Mustang Island considerably. Does that mean that there is no more seagrass? Have you had any investigation of the status of seagrass in the bay, and then kicking it over to Nature Conservancy? And would there have been more benefit had there been additional oyster fields and things to make a difference in that whole situation? Because unlike what people were expecting, the flooding came into the bay and then came at the island from inside.
Are you talking about Aransas Bay or Corpus Bay or what?
Corpus Bay.
Corpus Bay. Well,
This
Corpus
is Mustang
Bay.
Island. Looking at Mustang Island
Yeah,
now, I know
yeah.
you live on Padre, so
Right.
you didn't get to see all of that.
Well, but I fish Shamrock a lot. In fact, I was just there a couple of weeks ago.
Right.
And there's still vast areas of seagrass out there. I think Marine Science Institute is doing some studies. They
So-
charted all that.
So what is the Institute found with the seagrass situation? So that's the big question.
Yeah, we haven't specifically gone out there ourselves, but I would refer you to UT Marine Science Institute. Researchers there, Ken Dutton comes to mind, that may have a handle on just.
They have the baseline information
Yes.
on seagrass in that area, I believe, and I don't know if they've had a chance to return to see how it went.
Yeah.
That's going to have to be our final note for the morning. Thank you all.